After seemingly appearing out of nowhere a few days ago on Game Pass, Ninja Gaiden is finally back. Often considered by many old heads like myself as one of the original quote-unquote "it's hard as hell but it's a good time" games of the early 2000s, Ninja Gaiden has recently been a series that has been pretty quiet. The last solo release they had that was based on the story of our main character, Ryu Hayabusa, whose name I'm sure I butchered, was back in 2012 with the release of Ninja Gaiden 3. Up until pretty recently, I had assumed it was the same leagues as most of the games from that time period, dead and retired to maybe be remastered or rebranded entirely like the Gears of War series, whose own revival was received to mixed reviews from fans. Yet, as of a few days ago, we have some resemblance of hope. Team Ninja announced the reveal of Ninja Gaiden 4 at the Xbox Developer Direct show on the 23rd of January of this year, and with that announcement came the surprise of this game being shadow dropped on all current gen consoles later that same day, as well as Game Pass. The question remains, does it hold up to the gory, action-y kind of mess of the original? Well, let's find out. As with most remasters nowadays, this was coined as more of a remaster than a complete overhaul. In fact, the game feels and plays just as the original did back in the day on the Xbox 360, which I feel might throw some people off, but we'll get to that in a second. The game's story follows our token ninja as he tries to save the world from the archfiend bent on world domination. It isn't anything new to the series, so fans of the original will no doubt be interested in the more modern looking world to hack and slash your way through. More often than not in the hours I played, I wasn't really paying too much attention to the story itself. I mean, let's be honest, if you're playing these type of games to begin with, you're usually doing it for the combat, and this feels no different. As someone who had limited time with the Ninja Gaiden series as a teenager, the story here doesn't hold as much weight as it might to a lifelong fan of the series. It's by no means terrible, and honestly it doesn't fall flat in anything else like that, but I often find myself paying attention to more plot points and more disinterested in others, as with most action games of this genre. It's an action game at its core, and you could probably mute all the cutscenes and still go what's going on by the end of it. Is that a bad thing? No, I don't think so. The story has you traveling all around the world while you try to clean up another world-ending fiend outbreak, and the simplicity of the story lends itself to the idea that you can pay attention to as little or as much as you want and it won't ruin your experience. I'm sure there's some fans out there that hate that I've said these things, but I don't mean any of that in a negative way. The story just feels very 2008-ish, and some people might be thrown off by the simplicity of it in the current time of super overcomplicated and oversaturated stories with, extra things for no reason. Overall, I mean, I found myself not caring too much about what was happening because at the end of the day, I was trying to remove as many limps as possible, and I feel like most people would probably fall into the same boat as me on that regard. If anything, it really made me want to pick up the Ninja Gaiden Master Collection so I could get attached to all these names in the world itself. And yes, there was a Master Collection released in 2021, much like the Master Chief Collection, that allows you to play all the original games on modern consoles. Well played, Microsoft. You're doing well so far. Now, let me get to the one thing that I think is going to bother a lot of people. Though, it might not. It's either going to kill it for you or it's not going to kill it. So, though I pretty much admitted I wasn't a fan of the story, just because it's pretty generic and it feels like an early 2000s game, story-wise, let's take a moment to think about what this game is really trying to sell you. This game is meant to be enjoyed from a gameplay perspective, and I have to admit, they did a pretty damn good job. There's one thing I want to discuss before we get into the combat itself. The early 2000s were a time of revolution in the gaming space as a whole. We can say that there was the rise of the full 3D first-person shooters and third-person shooters, and like the full, like when graphics on consoles really become like a thing. One thing they didn't have down to a science at this time, though, was the idea of a camera that follows you and interacts with the environment like it should. This game's combat has a really unique feeling where the issue with the gameplay itself isn't so much the gameplay. Like, the hacking and slashing is perfect, but the camera will really, I think, piss off a lot of people. And it really honestly feels like an enemy more than some of the actual enemies themselves. I mean, I'm not even lying when I say that the camera reset button feels so janky sometimes. I felt like I was fighting with it more than the enemies that were chasing me down, or if I was trapped in a corner and the camera was glitching out. It really made it kind of... The perfect word would be awkward. But awkward almost doesn't do it justice, because if you can see, which you might not be able to see in some of these clips, the camera kind of like gets stuck, and then you're holding the reset button, and then you're kind of just like, oh, okay, I'm literally stuck. Now, I should clarify that I don't think this is inherently a deal breaker for someone like me, personally, as I am used to fighting with the camera, like the old God of War games and these old third-person action RPGs of the early 2000s and the early 2010s, and, you know, there's been some recently that are the same way. But I think for some it's going to be the thing that absolutely destroys their experience and makes you want to uninstall it. I even think I saw a pretty big streamer complaining about the game because the camera is very... I mean, it's outdated. That's the most honest way to put it. And I think it's either gonna... Fans of the original, of course, are gonna be like, oh, I'm used to this. You know, this doesn't bother me. But people that are kind of getting into the series, I think this might be a bit of a weird way to get into it. I mean, personally, I think if you get past the first hour, the pain of having to press my right bumper and reset the camera was gone. But part of me sees a world where a lot of newer fans... I mean, really myself included, because my time with Ninja Gaiden was pretty limited back in the day because I was terrible at it because I was a kid. But I think it might turn off some of the fans with the awkwardness of the camera system. That's all I'm going to say about the camera system for now, as it really feels like I'm beating a dead horse. The game systems and mechanics are from a game nearly 2 decades old, so some of the growing pains are expected, and honestly, if you can get past that, you're in for a treat. So the rest of the gameplay loop is honestly some of the most fun I've had since some of the original Devil May Cry games back on the same time period. It's pure hack and slash. There's no other way to describe it if I'm being honest. You have 8 options as far as melee weapons, and each one feels pretty decent besides a few at dismembering your enemies. And I mean, at the end of the day, that's all that matters, right? The combat feels smooth and precise when the camera isn't fighting against you, and honestly, you'll be fighting enough of like a big enough variety of enemies where you'll get your fill just by smashing your square button or whatever it is you're using. So you'll be fighting a variety of enemies throughout your playthrough, from the stereotypical ninjas like yourself to fiends and other demonic looking creatures who look as nasty as anything you dismember with your sword. You'll also have a good mix of dragons, wolves, disgusting looking pterodactyl enemies, and really everything in between. In typical 2000s fashion, most of the enemy types you see in each area are just recycled versions of the originals you face in the first level. But that doesn't change the fun factor at all. If anything, it makes it better. Watching Ryu, whose name I'm sure I just butchered again, go from executing a ninja to a fiend in the same animation style with limbs and blood flying all around you, it's just as satisfying no matter how you look at it, honestly. The areas you fight in are pretty linear in the way they push you forward, though you can veer off the beaten path every once in a while and, you know, kind of find some goodies off to the side if you're inclined to do so. That's how I found most of the extra weapons besides your main katana, so I can't recommend exploring enough. It won't take you more than a minute or 2 off your path. This isn't like a Skyrim where you go in a cave and you go on a 3-hour adventure. It literally, I would honestly say it won't take you more than a minute or 2 off your path to go just kind of explore a little bit. It doesn't hurt. So honestly, you have nothing to lose. Not to mention, anywhere you go, or anytime you go off the beaten path, I should say, and you get lost, all you have to do is hold your camera button, and it immediately points you to the direction you need to go. I mean, it's super convenient, and overall, you're either going to love the combat or hate it just based on the very fine intricacies of the camera, and maybe the simplicity of the combat. I mean, it's super satisfying, but it's pretty simple. You have a basic block, you have a basic hit, heavy hits, counters. There's nothing extremely groundbreaking about it, but it is a difficult game, so I think if you can get past all of that, and really it's not that much to get past, you'll probably enjoy everything the game has. But as my last thing, I want to say, with the monster month of February and all the games that are kind of coming out in the gaming world in general, it's really nice to have something to play for a couple days, you know, before it gets busy. Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, I will say, is a great way for Microsoft to give fans of the series a little bit of hope before the 4th numbered installment is released. Sometime in, I think I said Q3, Q4, so 3rd quarter, 4th quarter. So towards the second half of the year. Though I will admit the game feels simple in its execution, I'm also a firm believer that the game is a product of its time. And the funniest thing about that statement is that it still plays extremely well for the most part. The combat is fun and challenging on the higher difficulties, and the story is just interesting enough to keep you motivated to move forward in your adventure. This game is honestly the perfect introduction for newer fans to get into the series as a whole, and I'm hoping the next installment in the series sends it to the higher levels than the ones in the early 2000s ever sent it to. As always, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and make sure to comment, like, and subscribe if you would like to hear more.